The shuttle from the transit hub to Outpost Verath 7 smelled of industrial sealant and optimism, which Corvin Dast considered a reasonable atmospheric profile for a vessel transporting newly certified contact liaisons to frontier assignments. The optimism component was identifiable specifically in the way his two fellow passengers, both also newly certified, both also heading to frontier postings, were reading their briefing documents with the focused attention of people who believed that the briefing documents would prepare them for what they were going to find. Corvin had read his briefing document 4 times. He had reached the conclusion, somewhere in the 3rd reading, that it was a very good document about what a contact liaison assignment at a frontier outpost was supposed to involve, and that the gap between supposed to involve and actually involves was probably where most of the work lived. Verath 7 materialized through the viewport as a structure that was exactly the right size for its function, and not a square meter larger, which was consistent with the Accord's frontier outpost design philosophy, and which gave the station the aesthetic of a building that had been designed by people who were focused on what it needed to do, and had not had time to consider what it needed to look like. Corvin found this reassuring. Reassurance from architecture was a specific quality that he had developed across 3 years of contact liaison training, and that his colleagues had found, when he described it, slightly unusual. The senior coordinator met him at the docking bay. Her name was Doventall, and she had the bearing of someone who had been managing situations at the frontier for long enough that the frontier had become simply the location she worked in rather than a category of experience. She was approximately 50, with the specific quality of efficiency that people developed when they had spent a decade doing work that could not afford to be inefficient. And she shook his hand with the direct, no-surplus pressure of someone who assessed competence quickly and moved on. "Corvin Dast," she said. "Certified contact liaison, top quartile in protocol compliance, above average in interspecies communication methodology." She looked at him with the flat attention of someone reading a file they have already memorized. "Your predecessor described you as methodical. My predecessor watched me reorganize the filing system twice before he retired," Corvin said. "I'm not sure methodical was a compliment." The corner of Doventall's expression moved in the direction of something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Come to my office," she said. "We have an assignment to discuss." He followed her through corridors that had the familiar, functional smell of a station that was doing its job without excess. Recycled air, equipment maintenance compound, the faint metallic undertone of environmental systems working at steady capacity. He noted the layout as he walked, because noting layouts was a habit he had developed and that the briefing document had confirmed was operationally useful. He noted the Ithori Cultural Wing's location, identified by the specific atmospheric modifiers visible at the corridor junction, which adjusted the air composition to meet Ithori respiratory preferences, and noted that it was closer to the central hub than he had expected from the station schematics. Doventall's office was small and organized in the way of spaces that were being used for maximum productivity by someone who had decided what maximum productivity required and had arranged accordingly. She sat across the desk from him and described his first assignment with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who had given this explanation many times and had refined it to the form that produced the least counterproductive reaction in the person receiving it. He listened. He listened with the quality of attention that his contact liaison training had built and that 3 years of working with other people's frictions had refined, which was the quality of attention that did not insert its own response into the gaps in what it was hearing. He heard the Ithori proximity protocol. He heard the neurological assessment. He heard the A-tower monitored shared occupancy. He heard all of it with the composure of someone who is processing new information and has decided that composure is the correct processing environment. "Third night," he said. "Third night," she confirmed. "The supplementary briefing covers the protocol in detail. Read it at minimum twice." "How long has the outpost been running the assessments?" 5 years, since the preliminary contact agreement established the proximity protocol as a foundational confidence measure. She looked at him. "Every Accord personnel member who arrives at this outpost undergoes the assessment. It is not optional, and it is not negotiable, because it is the mechanism by which the Ithori determine whether a new human presence is compatible with continued cooperative occupation of this station." "And the Ithori cultural liaison currently assigned?" Veen, Doventall said. She has been at Verath 7 for 8 months. She has conducted 16 assessments. She paused, read the supplementary briefing. He read it that evening, in his new quarters, which were functional and quiet, and exactly the amount of space he needed. And he read it twice. And then he read it a third time in the specific way of someone who has found a document that rewards rereading, because each reading adds a layer to what the previous one established. The supplementary briefing covered the Ithori neurological architecture, the proximity assessment mechanism, its biological basis, the output it produced, and how the output was recorded and analyzed. It covered the Outpost's observation array and its configuration for assessment monitoring. It covered the behavioral protocols for the assessed personnel, what to do, what not to do, and the specific instruction, underlined in the document's formatting, not to perform being comfortable. The underlining was, he thought, doing a great deal of work. He sat in the quiet of his new quarters and thought about the gap between what he had expected his first assignment to be and what it was, and found that the gap was large enough to be interesting, which was a response that he recognized as specifically his, and that he filed under the category of things about himself that were probably worth paying attention to. The assessment room's door was on a different corridor than he had expected from the station schematics, which he mentioned to the Outpost's administrative officer who was escorting him, and who confirmed that the schematics had been updated twice since the original construction, and that the digital version lagged behind the physical reality by approximately 1 revision, which Corvin noted in the category of things to address in his first week of filing responsibilities. The room itself was the first thing that recalibrated his expectations, because it did not look like the room the supplementary briefing's procedural language had implied. It looked like a room that someone had thought carefully about, which was a different thing. 2 chairs, positioned at the angle of people who might turn toward each other without being required to face each other directly. A low table with 2 cups of something that the Ithori's atmospheric requirements and human palatability had been jointly considered in, which was a detail that his contact liaison training recognized as significant. The viewport was placed to be visible from both chairs, without either person having to turn away from the other to see it, which was the kind of spatial decision that only got made if someone had been in this room many times and had thought about what made it work. He sat in the chair that he assessed as the one a new person would naturally occupy, slightly closer to the door, slightly less settled into the space, and looked at the star field through the viewport and thought about the instruction not to perform being comfortable, and considered whether his current state was performance or genuine, and decided it was approximately 60% genuine and 40% something that would become genuine if he stopped examining it. The second door opened. Veen came in. His contact liaison training had given him a framework for the Ithori's physical appearance. Reality had given him Veen, who occupied the framework and extended past its edges in the way that people always extend past frameworks built from descriptions rather than from them. She was composed in the way the briefing had described, the neurological composure of a system processing its environment with comprehensive attention. But composure, described as a neurological feature, did not fully account for what composure looked like when it was present in a specific person, in a specific room on a specific evening, which was the quality of someone who was entirely in the room in a way that Corvin associated with people who were very good at whatever they did. Her long ears were in the position the supplementary briefing had described as neutral assessment orientation. She looked at him with the direct, informational eye contact that the briefing had described and that description had not fully prepared him for. "You've read the protocol," she said. "3 times, he said. She moved to the other chair and sat with the unhurried economy of someone who has sat in this chair many times and knows exactly how it fits. "The protocol describes the process," she said. "It doesn't describe what the assessment feels like." "No," he said, "it doesn't." "It feels," she said, with the specific precision of someone who has described this many times and has refined the description toward accuracy rather than toward comfort, like being known. Gradually, without being able to control what is known. She paused. Most people find this uncomfortable. He thought about this. He thought about what uncomfortable meant as a response to being known gradually and what the alternative response was. What do the people who don't find it uncomfortable find it? He said. She looked at him with a quality that he could not immediately categorize and that he would, later, understand was the beginning of the assessment. The first moment of the proximity network's activation in response to his nervous system. Interesting, she said. That seems like the right response, he said. Most people don't say that, she said. Most people are probably worried about being assessed, he said. I'm more interested in what the assessment is. She looked at him for a moment with the informational directness. Why? She said. Because understanding what something is, he said, is usually more useful than managing how you appear to it. The quality in her look changed by a degree that he registered without being able to specify what had changed. She picked up the cup from the table, the one that was on her side of the low table, which meant the other one was for him, and held it in both hands, and he understood from the holding that it was a posture of settled attention rather than consumption, and he picked up his own cup, and the 8 hours began. They talked, not continuously. The 8 hours had the rhythm of a long conversation that was also a long shared time, which meant that the conversation and the silence were both part of it, and both carried the same quality of two people being genuinely in the same space, rather than performing occupancy of it. He asked about the Ithori's contact framework history, not the version in the briefing documents, which he already had, but her version, the version of someone who had been working within the framework from the Ithori side, and knew where the framework's language matched the experience and where it didn't. She asked about his contact liaison training, not as a credential check, but as a genuine inquiry into what 3 years of training for this work had produced in him. He told her about the filing system he had reorganized twice, which she found interesting in the specific way of someone who recognized the impulse behind the reorganization rather than the reorganization itself. The star field outside the viewport did its patient work of being vast and still and providing scale without demanding response. And the observation array did its quiet work of recording the output that the assessment was producing. And neither of them was thinking about either of these things, which was the condition the supplementary briefing's underlined instruction was attempting to produce. The moment that the supplementary briefing had described as the assessment's midpoint, detectable by a specific shift in the Ithori liaison's postural indicators, arrived at approximately the 4-hour mark. And Corvin registered it not from the postural indicators, which he was not watching with the analytical attention that would have made them visible, but from a change in the quality of the room that he could not describe in technical terms, and that he filed under the category of things that were real before they were explicable. It's different, he said, not about anything specific. She looked at him. Yes, she said, is that what the midpoint feels like from your side? The midpoint is when the assessments network has completed its initial mapping, she said. What happens after is more comprehensive. She paused, with the quality of someone deciding how much of a technical process to render in accessible language. The initial mapping determines whether the proximity is compatible. The comprehensive phase determines what the compatibility means. And what does it mean so far? She was quiet for a moment that was not evasive. That is what the comprehensive phase determines, she said. I don't know yet. Are you curious? He said. She looked at him with the informational directness that he had been receiving for 4 hours, and that had become, in 4 hours, something he was reading rather than receiving. A specific quality of attention that was not social and was not performed, and was the most genuine version of the thing it was. Yes, she said, I am. Good, he said, me too. The remaining 4 hours had a different quality than the first 4, not more intense, not more significant, but more settled. The way a conversation changes after it has found its register and no longer needs to look for it. They talked about the Outpost's operational friction points, the areas where the contact framework's language and the practical experience of daily coexistence had gaps that needed managing. She described these from the Ithori side with the specific technical knowledge of someone who had been observing the friction points for 8 months and had opinions about their sources. He described his contact liaison training's approach to friction management, which was more systematic than her observations had expected, and which she found, from her expression, worth knowing about. When the 8 hours completed, and the monitoring staff's signal indicated the session's formal end, neither of them moved immediately. They sat in the 2 chairs with the quality of people who have been in a space long enough that leaving it requires a decision rather than simply the end of the reason to be there. The assessment results, he said. How long does the analysis take? Standard analysis is 2 hours, she said, sometimes longer depending on the output. And then the results go to the coordinator. Yes, he looked at the star field. Will you know what they say before she tells me? Veen looked at the viewport with the composed attention of her neurological architecture. "I will know what the assessment found," she said. "The specialist's analysis translates the output into terms the coordinator can act on." A pause. "What I know and what the analysis says are not always the same thing." He looked at her. "What do you know?" She looked at him with the directness that had been present since the beginning, and that had, over 8 hours, become something he recognized as a specific quality of her rather than a general quality of Ithori. "That the assessment was complete," she said, "which has not happened before in my 16 assessments at this outpost." He sat with this. "What does complete mean for the assessment?" "It means," she said carefully, "that it finished, that it produced everything it was designed to produce in both directions." She paused. "You will understand more about what that means in a few days." "In a few days," he repeated. "When the exchange becomes accessible," she said. "It takes time for the human nervous system to process the input. The processing is not immediate." He looked at her with the quality of attention he had been developing over 8 hours of practice. "You're telling me I received something tonight that I don't know I received yet?" "Yes," she said. "And in a few days, I'll begin to understand what it is." "Yes." He thought about this. He thought about the assessment and the 8 hours and the quality of the room at the midpoint and the thing he had filed under real before explicable. He thought about the supplementary briefing's instruction not to perform being comfortable, and about the 60% and the 40%, and about how the proportions had changed across 8 hours without him tracking the change. "That's interesting," he said. Veen's long ears moved. A small, specific shift that he didn't have a cultural reference for, but that his instincts, refined by 8 hours of paying attention to her specifically, registered as something. "Yes," she said, "it is." Reth's analysis took 6 hours, which Dove registered with the practiced attention of someone for whom the duration of an analysis was itself information. She called the relevant parties into the meeting room, herself, Veen, the Outpost's diplomatic officer. And at a decision she made 3 minutes before the meeting began that she did not fully explain to herself, Corvin and Reth delivered the results with the methodical precision of a scientist who had spent 9 years making technical information accessible to non-specialists without simplifying it past accuracy. Corvin listened. He listened to unprecedented and complete and bidirectional an exchange in the way he had listened to Veen for 8 hours, not inserting his own response into the gaps, but following the information to where it went. He looked at Veen once, during the part about the exchange becoming accessible over the following days, and she was looking at the table in the composed, attending way of someone who already knows what is being said and is present with its being said publicly. He looked at her and understood, in the specific and not yet explicable way of something that was real before it was explicable, that she had known, not performed the assessment toward this outcome. He understood that with a certainty he could not yet explain, but known, in the specific way of someone who had been mapping contingencies for 8 months, that complete was possible. After Reth finished, and after the diplomatic officer had retrieved the relevant protocol documentation from the archived contact framework materials, and after Dove had read the co-liaison assignment requirements with the neutral expression of someone processing a result that has significant implications, and is determining the correct sequence in which to address them. Dove looked at Veen and asked her about the protocol's implications for her assignment. Veen said nothing for a moment. Then, "I am aware of the protocol." Corvin looked at her. "Were you aware of it before the assessment?" She looked at him with the direct, informational eye contact that he had been receiving for 8 hours and that had, he was beginning to understand, been giving him information the whole time. "I was aware that a complete assessment was possible," she said. "I did not know it would occur." A pause. "I was not performing the assessment toward a specific outcome." "I know," he said. The room was quiet in the way of rooms that have registered something unexpected. Dove looked at him with the sharp attention of someone filing a data point. "You know," she said, with the neutral inflection of someone who was asking the question without asking it. "Not completely," he said. "Not yet." He looked at Veen, "but enough." Veen's ears moved. The shift was small and the room was full of people who were mostly looking at him. And he was the only person in the room who registered the shift, because he was the only person in the room who had been paying attention to her ears for 8 hours and had learned what to look for. The co-liaison assignment was formalized the following week, with the documentation that the protocol required, and the operational specifics that the protocol left to the parties involved. Because the protocol had been written for a theoretical possibility and did not have all the operational specifics worked out. Corvin and Veen worked out the operational specifics together, which was the first co-liaison work they did, and which was, Dove noted in her operational report, completed in 4 hours less than she had allocated for it. The Ithori political faction's representative arrived at Verath 7 4 weeks after the assessment, with the formal complaint documentation that the contact framework's dispute resolution mechanism required, and the specific quality of institutional opposition that had been organized around a real fear, and was expressing that fear through an argument that was not quite accurate. Corvin read the complaint documentation with the methodical attention of a contact liaison reviewing a formal instrument, and with the additional layer of someone who had been understanding an Ithori perspective at the neurological level for 4 weeks and could hear, underneath the complaint's biological inaccuracies, the fear that was driving them. The hearing was convened in the Outpost's formal meeting room, which had the sober, functional quality of a space used for things that mattered. The faction's representative, a senior Ithori official whose composure was the managed variety rather than the neurological variety, which Corvin had learned to distinguish, made the formal complaint with the precision of someone who had prepared extensively and believed the preparation was sufficient. Reth, whose relationship with politically motivated misrepresentation of his field was visibly personal, responded to the biological accuracy concerns with the compressed urgency of a scientist who has a great deal more to say than the meeting format allows. Veen said nothing, because the protocol assigned her as a party to the hearing rather than a participant in it, which was a distinction that Corvin thought the protocol had gotten wrong and which he could not fix during the hearing. He spoke because the co-liaison protocol gave him standing to speak, and because the complaint's fear was real, and the fear deserved a real response rather than a procedural one, and because 4 weeks of the assessment's exchange becoming accessible had given him something to say that he could not have said before the assessment. He did not argue against the faction's position. He addressed the fear underneath it, the fear of contamination, of losing something essential to contact with something different, of a process that was bidirectional producing an alteration that was irreversible. He addressed it in the plain language of a contact liaison who had been on the receiving end of the process. The faction was afraid of, and could speak to what it had and had not changed in him. He described what the exchange felt like, which was not contamination and was not alteration, and was, in the most accurate language he had for it, the experience of understanding something rather than simply knowing about it, which was a different thing, and which he did not think the faction's framework accounted for the difference between. He spoke about the Outpost, about 5 years of imperfect and effortful coexistence, about the friction points that Veen had described, and the systematic approaches that contact liaison training provided, and the gap between them that the co-liaison work was attempting to address. He spoke about the fear as a real thing that deserved to be taken seriously, and about the conclusion the faction had drawn from the fear as a thing that taking the fear seriously did not require. He spoke for 11 minutes, which was longer than he had planned and shorter than what he had to say. He sat down. The hearing produced a commission, which was what serious institutions produced when they encountered serious questions they could not resolve in a meeting, and the commission's terms were broad enough to be genuine and specific enough to be useful, which was a better outcome than the faction had intended to produce, and a better outcome than the Outpost's diplomatic officer had expected. Veen's assignment was not withdrawn. The co-liaison partnership continued. The faction's representative left with the formal commission documentation and the specific quality of someone who had not won the argument they came to win and had received, in its place, something that required them to think rather than simply oppose. Dove in the corridor after the hearing, looked at Corvin with the 11-year Frontier Coordinator's assessment of a person who had done something she had not entirely predicted. "The exchange material," she said. "You used it." "I described what I experienced," he said, "which is what a contact liaison is supposed to do with direct experience. Most contact liaisons don't have direct experience of Ithori neurological exchange. Most contact liaisons haven't had a complete proximity assessment," he said. "The experience is relevant. It would have been strange not to use it." She looked at him with the corner of her expression, moving toward the thing adjacent to a smile again. "Read the commission's terms when they're finalized," she said. You're going to be asked to contribute testimony. I assumed, he said. She walked away with the efficiency of someone who had the next 4 things to do and had determined their sequence. He stood in the corridor and thought about testimony and commissions and the faction's fear, which was real, and the Outpost's patient work, which was ongoing, and the specific and useful experience of understanding something rather than simply knowing about it. The assessment room was unoccupied. He went there anyway, because it had become, in 4 weeks, a room he thought of as his in the way that spaces became yours when something significant happened in them, and because significant things benefited from being sat within the space where they had occurred. He sat in his chair. The star field was through the viewport. The commission report, Reth's preliminary findings, distributed to the co-liaisons for review before the formal finalization, was in his document folder. He had read it twice. Veen came in through the second door at the hour that was not scheduled, and was simply the hour when both of them were not doing other things, which had become, in 4 weeks of co-liaison work, the hour they used for the conversations that did not fit the co-liaison schedule, but were part of the work anyway. She sat in her chair. She looked at the commission report on the low table between them. You used the exchange material in the hearing, she said. You heard the hearing. I was a party to it, she said. I was required to be present. I know. He looked at the star field. The fear is real. The faction's biology is wrong, but the fear is real. I could speak to the fear because the exchange gave me a way to understand it. She was quiet for a moment. Most people who have undergone a proximity assessment describe the experience afterward in terms of the assessment, she said. The process, the monitoring, the results, they don't describe what it felt like from inside it. The process and the monitoring and the results are in the supplementary briefing, he said. What it feels like from inside it is what I had that the faction didn't have a counter-argument for. She looked at him with the direct, informational quality that he had been reading for 4 weeks, and that had become, in 4 weeks, a language he was approaching fluency in. What does the exchange feel like from your side? She said. Now 4 weeks in, he thought about this with the genuine attention it deserved. The exchange had been becoming accessible since the morning after the assessment, not as memories, not as specific information, but as understanding, the way fluency in a language arrived before the grammar was fully learned. He understood aspects of Veen that he could not trace to specific observations. He understood the Ithori composure as a neurological feature rather than a social one in the direct way of something experienced rather than described. He understood the quality of her attention and the meaning of the ear positions and the specific register of her silence that was thinking versus the register that was arrived. Like learning a language through immersion, he said. Before you know the grammar, you know what things mean. You can't always explain how you just know. She was quiet with this for a moment. That is, she said, a more accurate description than the specialist's report. The specialist's report is technically accurate, he said. It's describing the mechanism. What it feels like is the mechanism from the inside. Yes, she said, what the assessment feels like from my side is. She paused with the precision of someone choosing words for a translation that had no perfect equivalent. Like a question that has been answered, not a specific question. The question that is always present in the assessment network when it is processing proximity, whether this person's nervous system is compatible with mine. And the answer, in a complete assessment, is not simply yes. It is another pause, more than yes. He looked at her across the low table with the commission report between them. More than yes, he said. The Ithori language has a word for it, she said. The word for the answer that a complete assessment produces. It translates approximately as the kind of compatible that remains compatible. She looked at the star field. Most proximities are compatible for the duration of the assessment. The complete assessment finds the kind that continues. The room held this in the way of rooms that had been built for something and were doing it. The star field through the viewport. The 2 chairs at the angle of people who had turned toward each other. The commission report on the table. The observation array present in every surface and not currently active because this was not an assessment. The kind that continues, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at the commission report. He looked at the star field. He looked at Veen, who was looking at him with the direct, informational quality of someone who was giving him information and was aware that they were giving it and had decided to give it without managing it. The commission wants testimony about the exchange experience, he said. Yes. From both parties. Yes, that means we're going to have to describe this. he said, indicating the quality of the room and what it contained. In documentation. Yes, she said. In the specialist's technical language, and in whatever language the commission determines is accessible to the parties who need to read it. That's a lot of translation, he said. Yes, she said. Contact liaison work usually is. He looked at her. Good thing we have a co-liaison, he said. Her ears moved, fully, unhurried, to the position he had been learning for 4 weeks and now knew as the one she wore when something had been received that was worth receiving. Yes, she said, it is. Outside the viewport, the frontier continued its ordinary business of being the place where 2 civilizations had agreed to practice being in the same space, and the star field held its patient position, and the commission report waited on the table between 2 chairs that were at the angle of people who had turned toward each other, and were not, at this hour, in any particular hurry to turn away.